Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your patience. Welcome to another curatorial lecture here at the Walters Art Museum. My name is Joy Davis. I'm the manager of adult and community programs here at the Walters, and I have the pleasure of introducing Joaneath Spicer, who is the curator of Renaissance and Baroque art here at the Walters. Welcome, Joaneath, and we'll get started with the program.
It's really good to be here this evening. I have to admit to our audience that the delay is because of my technical inabilities. So thank you. I thank you for your patience here, because this is such a subject so close to my heart. This talk is about the little girl in this portrait, Giulia de Medici. There's no disagreement as to her identity today, but how that identity was lost, indeed literally erased, and rediscovered has a lot to say about the evidentiary role of realistic portraiture, and also about, even more fundamentally, about how we see. How we may see what we expect to see or want to see, especially in the case of racial identity. Although I first began thinking about this Walters portrait over 20 years ago, at the much appreciated prodding of a researcher in Boston, Mario Valdez, to whom I'm delighted to give a shout out, and then published on the painting in the exhibition revealing the African presence in Renaissance Europe in 2012 here at the Walters. I continue to see new things in the painting. Which I find very hopeful. One always hopes that a subject is not, sort of finished as one, but that you continue to see the richness of a narrative. So that is one of the reasons for this talk this evening. The artist Jacopo Pontormo was in his time the most in-demand portraitist at the Medici court in early 16th century Florence. He was excellent at using subtle means to convey a message, not just facial likeness, but also although he was very good at that, but of aristocratic stature and responsibility. So very briefly, what are we looking at? An older woman in veiled widow's attire, seated with her right arm resting on a table. She looks directly out at us with a calm, confident expression. With her left hand, she holds a brown disc. Fingers of her right hand are grasped by a casually dressed, apparently shy child who looks off to the side. The positioning of the child creates a visual impression of the child being sheltered by the older woman. In our time here together, I want to trace the fortunes of the portrait as an object and of assumptions about the child and her racial identity. This inevitably involves the role of implicit or explicit bias and the challenges we all have sometimes in just seeing freshly. The painting descended through the Salviati family, and gradually the names of those depicted were lost. Paintings in palaces of large extended, next slide, please. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Wait a minute. The painting descended through the Salviati, and gradually the names of those depicted were lost. Paintings in palaces of large extended families did not have nameplates. That came much later. So in the last inventory of paintings in the Salviati family palace, the painting is simply inventoried as a woman with a little girl. Then the collection was dispersed, which is to say, sold. In this context, let us look for a moment at this fine painting on the left by a Medici court portraitist who studied with Pontormo, by Agnolo Bronzino. The woman's dress and composure suggest she is from an aristocratic family, presumably in Florence. But scholars have not been able to identify the woman and her child. Basically, their identity has been erased. It can be supposed that the boy is her son, given his comfort in their closeness. But what are their names and their story? There's nothing. So this is a sense of what the status then was of the Walters painting. Simply nobody's. Next, please. But the painting appears again in an Italian collection, that of Marcello Mazzarenti, cataloged in 1881 as Vittoria Colonna by an unknown painter. The child is gone, painted out quite cleverly. So in fact, you don't even realize that something is missing. Indeed, nobody did realize that there was something missing for 50 years. But why was she painted out? I personally think that the answer lies in the new name, Vittoria Colonna. But we will look at various options. Now, the photo on the left is actually the one that was taken when the painting, after the painting entered the Walters collection, but it hadn't changed. There had been no change since then. To consider, wait a minute. To consider why the child had been painted out, we need to tease out, could I have the next, please? Yes. We need to tease out the strategy of the dealer or agent who acquired the painting, perhaps in the early 19th century, and then had to come up with some bases for trying to sell it. Basically, why that would be difficult is because paintings of widows, even known ones, were normally of little or no interest to anybody outside the family. Indeed, widows were of little interest to anybody often inside the family. This was not a time of a high point for women's rights or status. However, Vittoria Colonna must have seemed like a godsend to the dealer, because Vittoria Colonna was a pious, childless, very good poet who was a close friend of Michelangelo and had the potential, because there was always interest in portraits of good poets and other artists. So she would be the ticket to rename the painting, but and few people living would have any idea what she really looked like. The little painting on the right is assumed to be a portrait of Vittoria Colonna. She doesn't look much at all like the painting on the left. There are various other portraits and they all look, supposed portraits, they all look different. But the chief question was that she was childless. So the painting needed to be childless. Next, please. The proposition was often raised by Walter's visitors of African ancestry as to whether Giulia was painted out because she was of African ancestry. In other words, a case of racial bias. The catch with this is that most white people today do not immediately recognize the child as of African ancestry. And I would expect that this was even more true among Italian 19th century collectors. We don't all see the same thing, even when we look at together, as I've often experienced with talking with groups in the gallery. Some will recognize the child's ancestors and ancestry, and others will not see it at all. And it's a big shock. Each group is taken back by the reading of the others. It's a good lesson to us all. Then I think there is another factor. The fashion for including a small, dependent, usually enslaved Black child in portraits of the wealthy began around the same time with Titian's a very well-known painting of Laura Dianti from around 1525 on the left. So if Giulia's African heritage had been more obvious to people then, there would have been no need to paint her out, because she would have been likely have been assumed to be simply a servant. It was as the presumed daughter of the older woman that she caused problems for any sale. Next, please. In 1937, so not so long after the Walters became a public gallery, and conservation department began to develop its now fame here at the Walters, the painting was x-rayed and cleaned. To everyone's surprise, the image of a child was revealed beneath the added layer of paint. The photo on the right is really, I think, quite a moving image. It's as if her identity and story are kind of breaking through, looking through sort of a hole in the wall. Next, please. Research by Walter's curator, Edward King, carried out in the 1930s alongside the conservation treatment, led to the identification of the widow. The most direct comparison connected her to a portrait to which her name had long been attached in the Medici former quarters in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. Indeed, it certainly appears that the portrait here on the left in the Palazzo Vecchio certainly appears to be based on, in fact, on the Walters painting. This comparison permits a discussion of Maria's complexion in the Walters painting. The later version on the left is probably, in fact, a more accurate rendering of Maria's skin tone. At some point, either in the 1930s or earlier, the Walters painting was a bit over-cleaned, and some of the surface values were lost. It was popular in the 16th century, however, for aristocratic women to strive for very pale skin and indeed to use a form of white lead, which is actually quite toxic, to artificially lighten their skin. But the skin tone on the left still seems more accurate. That could mean that Giulia might also have had a bit sort of warmer a skin tone originally. Next, please. Now, the identification of Maria Salviati did not actually simplify the identification of the child. Maria Salviati had indeed one child, a boy, her son Cosimo, who became Duke of Florence. And by this time, by the late 1530s, he was an adult. Edward King tentatively identified the child as him, basically for lack of an alternative. One subsequent extension of this identification, made within the framework of Duke Cosimo's extensive use of the arts for propaganda purposes, saw this as Cosimo's homage to his mother for her careful attention to his education. That might be a tidy solution, except for the fact that most viewers have trouble seeing the child as a boy. For this, we can turn once more to the child in the Florentine court portrait on the left. The boy there has short tousled hair, standard haircut for a small boy, and also typical for a small boy, even though you can see just a detail, is that he has a high cut neck, a jacket on, with a bit of a under blouse or shirt showing just at the top. In other words, very typical boys' clothing. The child in the Walters portrait wears a casual chemise. Cosimo was in fact raised to be a tough little soldier, like his deceased father. If Cosimo wanted to celebrate his mother giving him a basically military education, would this shy child personify that upbringing? I don't think so. Next, please. The braided hair and clothing in the Walters painting are not only not those of a boy, they are specifically those of a girl. The girl in another Walters Italian portrait of the same period by Veronese has the same hairstyle, as you can see in the detail here at the bottom of the screen. Now, the name, excuse me, in 1992, a Canadian scholar, Gabriel Langdon, doing a study of women in the Medici family, demonstrated that there were two little girls in Maria's life. In point of fact, her wards, Bianca de Medici and Giulia de Medici, natural daughters, respectively, of Duke Cosimo and of his predecessor, Duke Alessandro. Bianca's appearance is known from the portrait in the upper center by Bronzino, showing her wearing a portrait medal of her father, Cosimo. This is not that child. So the focus then turned to the other child, the natural daughter of Alessandro, for whom there was at that time no portrait or known. Go to the next, please. Alessandro is really the key to all of these discussions. Here we have 3 portraits of him and one of the man that I assume in any case, and many scholars assume is his father, although there is disagreement on that. Alessandro de Medici, first Duke of Florence, was apparently a difficult person in life, and his legacy has proved equally difficult, but for very different reasons. Today, as we will come to see, we would simply say that he was Black and go on with it, and nobody would think anything more about it. But that was not something that he wished to be said in his own time. He guarded everything about his own history and very image very carefully. The most likely family history is that Alessandro was the child of a non-consensual relationship between Cardinal Giulio de Medici, who became Clement VII, Pope Clement VII, we see in the center, and an enslaved African woman in the Medici palace in Rome. We know her name. Her name was Simonetta. She later in life wrote to her son trying to get some support, as that she, who had been married off to a mule driver, that they were very poor and they really needed some help. And from what we know, he did not reply. So here you can see, oh yes. So now there are two of the factors that suggest to me, although these things are very hard to demonstrate or to be certain about at all, but two of the things is that Alessandro had 2 children, a boy and a girl. And one he named Giulio, the boy he named Giulio, and the girl he named Giulia. It would appear that he was attempting to identify with Giulio de Medici as his father. I would also say that the nose, if you look, they really have some very similar facial features there. That nose is quite It's quite a striking nose, and they share it exactly. But thinking about the father is not so important here. But if you will see in the portrait on the left and on the portrait on the right, two paintings, both of them appear to be made on the basis of the same drawing, that the face is exactly the same. And even in the smaller portrait, you will notice that he is wearing a beret, as you can see more clearly in the larger painting, so that his hair is basically covered, and that you see this sort of shadowed effect that Pontormo is so well known for, which makes it utterly impossible to see his hair. The only time you see his hair depicted is on medals, where it's since you normally don't wear a hat. This is hard to avoid, but here it is normally simply given the appearance of sort of waving locks, short waving locks. Could I have the next, please? Now we really get down to it. Here are two portraits of Alessandro, again, both made from the same drawing, but made by two different artists. The one on the left is the one we saw before by Pontormo, and the one on the right is by his student, Bronzino. The one by Bronzino is made after Alessandro's death, whereas the one on the left, like the other portraits, was made before his death. So while there are absolutely no descriptions of him that in any way imply that he has some African ancestry before his death, after his death, that's no longer true. Here in this portrait, if you, I know that the background is dark, but if you will, first you will notice there's no hat. But if you look then very carefully, that the artist Bronzino has allowed this tightly curling hair to become visible, so that there is no question in this painting here, but this is a man of African ancestry, something that would have been completely impossible to represent, even in these small details, before his death. And indeed, before this painting and the identification of the importance of this painting was one of the aspects that I was quite proud of the exhibition revealing the African presence, because before this painting had been basically, wasn't on view, and was considered simply a kind of copy of the earlier paintings. But when we did the show, when the show was in Princeton, our partners, the giant photos of Alessandro in this portrait were all over the town, which was quite magnificent, I have to say. Next, please. I have to say that many scholars had initially been quite shocked by the proposal that Alessandro was Black, or certainly before the exhibition. But I'm happy to say that attitudes do change. People's capacity to see becomes more subtle, and his Blackness has now been completely normalized. So, step by step. In rounding off this discussion, there are some details that didn't quite fit with the line of discussion earlier, but that are important to address. First of all, we never actually looked at Giulia along with her father. And while I'm not going to say that she has his nose, which she doesn't appear to be, thank goodness, she, certainly on a little girl, she does have his mouth, exactly. I think that the fact that her incredibly pale skin, which may in fact be partially a result of mentioned before of over cleaning in the distant past, does continue to confuse visitors today, as I am sure even in a slight stage it was intended to do at the time. Maria Salviati is holding this brown disc that she's holding was meant to be a bronze medal. The surface of the paint is unfortunately rubbed there, as it is elsewhere in the painting, and the identity of the figure commemorated by the medal can't be established today. But the scholarly consensus is that it would surely have been a portrait of Alessandro, such as the one here on the left, and that its role here as a respectful reference to Giulia's deceased father, much as you saw Bia wearing a medal of her father, who was certainly not dead at the time, but introducing that same reference for Giulia. But there is also another aspect to Alessandro's death. Is actually he was assassinated in 1537. He was not necessarily a nice guy, and had lots of enemies. And it was, in fact, Alessandro's death that suddenly put Cosimo in line for the dukedom. So the overall intention of the portrait is assumed to be, which I certainly agree, to be a demonstration that the child was well cared for, which, for others to hang proudly in the palace and to say, okay, we're taking care of the kids. For which, if they had not taken care of them at this point, there would have been a lot of suspicion. But I mean, he had nothing to do. No scholar thinks he had anything to do with the assassination, but you can easily imagine that might have been supposed at the time, because this was a big plum of a position. Now, we should also note that in life, Giulia married well. She married a minor prince, and her descendants are flourishing today. So she had, in some ways, then finally herself an uneventful life of a Medici, a kind of uneventful calm quality that her portrait did not enjoy. But the history of the portrait as a physical object demonstrates how important it is to understand who is looking at a work of art, the audience in a larger sense, public, but also private, owner, and also critic and historian, especially as we've seen in various points in her the trajectory of this portrait, when the interpreter may not be satisfied with what they see, and that may alter the story, of which we must always be very careful. I can say that happily now Giulia is now surrounded by people who love her and her story. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joaneath. I see that we have one question there. I want to encourage folks to ask a few questions. We have a few minutes to answer them. There's a technical question here, a logistics question from Drew. Are these recorded somewhere where I can share a link? And yes, they are. So I see that you're viewing on Facebook. And yes, you can view them. It'll be here for you. Once this session ends, you'll also be able to find it on YouTube. So you can share those links to your friends and families and colleagues and show some support to Joaneath's work, but also, of course, the Walters. As we have some more questions coming in, Joaneath, if I could ask you a question.
Yeah, please.
I'm curious about how, and you mentioned this a little bit in your talk, so I don't want to be too redundant, but I'm curious about the the cloaking or the veil of the mother or the parental figure in the portrait, and if that plays a part in the understanding of taking care of the children and kind of presenting that right to the audience, whoever walks through the halls of the family house. Is that a factor, or was that just a common way of dress at that time?
Well, I think it's a common way of dressing for widows.
Perfect.
Widows.
Question from Meg Ferguson, by the way. I just want to bubble it up. Was the headscarf typical for a widow or just a lady of her status?
No. This is a widow. This is specifically a widow, and because she was their cousin, and so she's an older woman. It's not like she has too much to do, and she becomes the ward of these two girls. So so it happens to be she's the one who's doing it, but because she herself happens to be of the senior branch of the Medici family. Well, her husband was from the less senior branch of the family. She herself has great status in the family. And so they would know that if other people from outside saw her as the protector, as it were, of these children, that they were being protected.
Wonderful.
She was the person to do it.
Absolutely. There's a question here from Jessica Saaz. Hi, Jessica. Is there any recorded history on the girl via baptism or other documents, primary sources?
Now, here I'm going to say there may well be, but I haven't dealt with that material in many years. I would, if for someone who might be interested in that, I would look at Gabriel Langdon's book, although there may be something more recent, but on Medici women. She really has a lot to contribute there. In that regard, I have to say, there is also a portrait of a woman, otherwise unidentified, of in her 20s or something, about that some people think is Giulia. To my mind, the iconographical explanation of the details in the painting is so far-fetched that all I can say is it might be her, but not, but I can't prove it by this painting. So therefore, I have a tendency to leave it aside, because if you can't leave it aside without all this odd treatment of the sculpture of her chair, which you have to explain then, and it doesn't work well. So I leave it alone.
I also just want to, for the audience or for other scholars or burgeoning scholars, that's a really great best practice as a scholar, is that if you can't define everything that we're seeing here to be the narrative, then it's best practice to leave it to chance or someone else to kind of dig into the narrative or until those resources present themselves. We have a lot of questions coming in, which is fantastic.
Could I just say something here from that regard? Yeah. And that is, we had the connection, the link on the, people can find this when it flips over to YouTube. Well, I suppose it's now on YouTube. There's the link right on there to the Walters website, where you can download Revealing the African Presence in Renaissance Europe as a free ebook. Which after we had sold some thousands, 2,600 copies, we turned it into an ebook just to make it available to anybody who would want it. And we know that thousands of people have, and we're ecstatic if others do. But that's not a bad place to start for many aspects.
We have a really interesting question here from Richard Wiseman. Is art history always so wonderfully gossipy? And if I could answer yes, sometimes it is, in fact, more gossipy or saucy than you expect. But what do you think, Joaneath?
I know, Richard. Of course, any human endeavor is, and I'm sure in your own field you will find it equally so. But one of the things about art history is, after all, it's quite interpretive.
Right.
It's not like a mathematical a science. And while that can be its glory, is that you get to something, as with poetry, where you get to some higher truth. But on the other hand, it does leave it open to human failing as well. So there you are.
Oh, this is a really interesting question. I don't know if you can answer it, so it's A-okay. This is from Lauren King. Did the Medici family continue to recognize Giulia as an adult, or was she just married off to the minor prince?
Well, I mean, she was. I think she was continued to be recognized. I don't recall any reason to think that she was not. And I mean, getting married off to a prince is not nothing, you know. So I would say that she was treated pretty well. And they had plenty of money. You know, so I think she did. Everything was arranged marriages then, so it's not like you get your pick, like some other daughter would get their pick of no, sorry, it's who your father wants to have alliances with, you know, basically. So so she was probably you know, subject to the same issues, but we have no reason to think that she was not you know, sort of part of the family.
Absolutely. Great answer. This is a weird meta question. This is from Walter's staff member, Chandy, via Lisa Anderson-Jew, who's another staff member. When did correspondence, the relationship between Alessandro and his mother, become known? Was this suppressed until a short time after his death, or did it come up centuries later? Dense but good question.
Yes, it's a very good question. Very curatorial question. The issue came up centuries later. It would have come up through research, through archives. You know, to pull this out. So even personal letters, it depends on the house, and depends on their record keeping, or whether there were fires or all kinds of things. But basically, pretty much all correspondence, unless it was burned at the time for some reason, would have been kept. But that doesn't mean that anybody would much know about it. Until somebody in modern times did the archival work. But he started being of interest in the 19th century. So there have been a couple of people have started to do biographies of him, and then that kind of fell to the side. But there are now some really good biographical treatments of him. So he's flourishing historically in any case.
That's great. And interesting, right? Because that's an access point to the rest of the family.
Yes, absolutely. I find it's a heart-wrenching a letter, and you know, his decision to apparently, from what we know, to ignore it. You would have to chalk this up to his desire, just that this was not part of his past, that he wanted to engage with. He really wanted to forget it. Now, there are lots of people, for one reason or another, decide that they want to put an end to a previous stage in their life and just move on. And sometimes this is very healthy, you know. So in that regard, he's not unusual. It's just a bit heart-wrenching to think that he couldn't send some money to his mother.
I have some more questions. There's a lot of questions
Yeah,
about
yeah.
Julia's grandmother specifically. We'll try to go through as many as possible. Andrew Loke asks, how much do scholars know about Julia's grandmother? And then I'll follow up with a question from Jessica.
Basically nothing.
Okay.
I mean, this is simonetta. This is simonetta. Of course, you would have a grandmother on her mother's side, but nobody knows about her either. So I can easily say one knows more about her mother on her grandmother on her mother's side than on her father's side than on her mother's side about, the which would have been a white noblewoman. We know nothing about her. So erasure is sort of passed out fairly even-handedly there. Women often basically, once they were no longer bearing heirs, were not such a hot commodity.
And that's so interesting to think about how that fact and how that factors into their history and the telling of their history, because then they kind of fall off of the historic record.
Yes, absolutely. Then and in that portrait we showed from the National Gallery that we kept showing, where we don't know, that means that her son's story has fallen off the record too, both of them.
It's wild. Jessica Saz asks, are there portraits of Simonetta? Which it seems like there aren't, but I'm just curious. And are there any paintings of her possibly being in them?
No, I would say no, almost certainly they're not. And I think there's no reason why there would be, from the times, there's no reason why there would ever have been a portrait of Simonetta. And no reason why there would have been one of her where she is simply in a painting. That context of showing servants in a sort of family setting does occasionally happen in the 16th century, but it is much more a factor in Dutch 17th century family, where servants who are simply part of the family, whether they're black or white, are simply depicted along with the family. But that's not the tenor in Italy at that time.
And I think we're at our last question. I think we'll end on a really good one. This is from another one from Andrew. How was race perceived in 16th century Florence?
Well, race was really an evolving concept at that time. You still have the word, a variation of the word race does exist then, but it still had much more of a connotation of family or people who were all related, rather than it could even be by nationality. You could still talk about, well, first of all, you could talk about the race, a king's race, meaning his family, his ancestors, that it was a noble, that it was a noble race, they were all heroic and et cetera, et cetera. Total virtue. Then you could have the idea still of the French race, the horrible French race, or if you were in France, the horrible Italian, sort of a race. So that was deemed to be some group that had some connections together, and you certainly could have that, of course, applied to blacks, who would be more likely to be referred to in some form of the word black in French or Italian or whatever, or as Moors. And so you wouldn't necessarily use the word race. You might simply refer to them as Moors, which could have the connotation, first of all, as a North African, but sometimes when you sort of accommodate a term, it takes over kind of local connotations. And in Italy, for example, there would be less a question of many North Africans being, although there were some North Africans, certainly in traders and diplomats, lots of people in Italy. But in terms of people at the lower end of the scale, the recently free or enslaved would have been more from sub-Saharan Africa, but they would all be called sort of Moors. It's a very interesting fluid situation, because there are so many ways that one's status could change instantly. You know, if a child was not a child who was born, was a natural child of the family, of the father of a family, who was taken to an orphanage instead of being raised in the family, as Giulia obviously was, would be free the second the child crossed the doorstep of the orphanage. So, you know, in many ways, for some children, I mean, Giulia is a second generation, but from many, then, if your mother was the African servant, it would, in some ways, almost be better for you to be taken to an orphanage, if you were taken from an orphanage as a tiny baby, because then you were raised free and with a trade and went on with your life. You know, you weren't with your mother, but it meant that your options in life were not dependent on somebody else. You know, so it's quite a complicated period. That's for sure. And certainly you see, it's a time when you see, you know, doctors, lawyers, university professors, all kinds of people, saints, were Black at this period. So it's there's no, you know, it's one of those things that always strikes me is, you know, we were all there. You know, is that it's much more of a mixture than one might have thought. And in some places, for instance, in Spain at this period, there was a very high percentage of Black residents in some cities, which certainly had a continuing influence on all kinds of aspects of Spanish society. So it's Giulia's is a very interesting story, as much for the ups and downs of her of the story than of her life, which I'm happy to say seems to have been, you know, she wasn't in any way exploited or taken advantage of, you know. So anyway, it's a reminder, though, to all of us, is that to be careful when you're looking.
Absolutely. It's a great take. So I thank you, Joaneath, for being here and sharing your work. In some ways, your life's work, in some ways, work that's ongoing. And I want to thank the audience for being here, sharing. There's so many great questions today. So I want to thank you all for taking part, both on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank the digital team here, our back-end staff, our digital team, our coordinators. Thank you so much for making this happen. Without this, we wouldn't be here. So thank you so much. And we'll see you in the next program. We have one coming up this Thursday at 5:30, and we look forward to seeing you there. Have a wonderful night.